But we still get messages from Boris and his team, that nothing can be ruled out. So if you ever ask them, will you 100% guarantee us we can have Christmas? They won't give you that. Let's have a little listen to Boris and Sajid Javid over the weekend.
I think I'm going to stick with the formula I've used before, which is that I'm pretty confident, or absolutely confident, this Christmas will be considerably better than last Christmas.
You are not ruling out a circuit breaker or some new restrictions coming in before Christmas.
But there are no guarantees in this pandemic. I don't think at this point we just have to keep everything under review.
Yes, that's a little Christmas message from those who rule us there. Let's go straight to my first guest. He's a member of HART, the Health Advisory and Recovery Team, Dr. Jonathan Engler. Good evening, Jonathan.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for having me on this
Thank
evening.
you for joining us. What I want to try to do is let's just try and be realistic about the statistics, the factual statistics that we have so far in terms of Omicron, and then ask the question, does this justify any of this panic-stricken approach to the new variant? So after more than 3 weeks, the Omicron death toll, or shall we say deaths related to Omicron, we don't know whether they were with or from or anything like that. After 3, that's 12. We understand there are now 129 people in hospital. Don't forget there's 67 million people who live in this country. That's set against 12,000 new cases of COVID per day. So if nothing else, 12 deaths and 129 hospitalizations in 3.5 weeks with 12,000 cases a day. That proves to me, or certainly is a very strong indication, that just as they discovered in South Africa, this new variant isn't quite the medical catastrophe the government seems to want us to think it is.
That's right, Kevin. If you actually look at the hospital data in the UK, there are currently around 900 daily admissions with COVID, and it's important to remember these are with COVID. And that basically has oscillated, the number being admitted has oscillated between about 1,100 and 700 since the summer. And it's currently pretty flat. And in fact, the number in hospital is currently in the UK, according to the dashboard, the last available date was 17th of December, was 7,482. This is actually down from 9,500 on the 2nd of November, which is the last sort of...
Can I just, sorry to interrupt you, Jonathan, I just want to compare those figures that tally with the ones I've got here, that there are 7,600 people in hospital, and on average 900 new admissions a day. Now, this time last year, there were 19,000 in hospital, so more than double that, and an average of 2,000 new admissions every day. So we are,
That's right.
We are less than half as bad as we were this time last year, and yet the government is threatening us with the same restrictions.
Yeah, and of course it's important to realize that we are also testing a huge amount more people than we were a year ago. I mean, at the moment, approximately 1 in 50 of the UK population is testing daily. We're carrying out about 20 tests per 1,000 per day, which is an insane number of tests. It's actually around 100 times the number of tests we were carrying out in April, May of 2020, per head of population, that is. So if you carry out so many tests, you will find incidental COVID. And there will be a higher proportion of the admissions will be incidental COVID. So I've heard, for example, from a pediatric nurse that the pediatric wards are full of cases with COVID, but none of them were admitted with COVID. These are all incidental findings. They were admitted with a variety of other ailments, but because there's a lot of virus around and because we're using very sensitive testing, we're detecting it a lot. It's not necessarily clinically relevant.
And to layman like me, I feel like I'm trapped in a kind of Alice in Wonderland swirling mass of insanity, because you know, government ministers now, particularly Sajid Javid and Boris as well, their whole shtick on TV is to sort of reluctantly, grudgingly concede that Omicron does look as if it's a less virulent form of the virus than we've had before, that it isn't as dangerous, that in fact most people will just not feel very well for a few days and then they'll be okay. It doesn't seem to be particularly lethal, doesn't seem to require much hospitalization. So whilst they concede that, they've come up with a new way to say Omicron is still terrifying to us, and that is this, that it is multiplying, it is transmitting at such a rate of knots that even a very small percentage of those ending up in hospital will cause the NHS to be overwhelmed. But the most recent figures, the death rate this week on Saturday was 5% down. And the average daily fatalities now are 112. I think this time last year we were into four figures. So why, what I'm asking you, Jonathan, why is this government so intent on catastrophizing what should be quite an optimistic story?
Well, that's really a question for them. It's almost as if they are addicted to control of the population, and they just don't want to let go. You've got to remember that there are a series of public health officials who are basically running the country at the moment. They've never been in such held in such high regard before. They've never had so much power, and it's almost as if they just don't want to let go. So they will find anything to continue maintaining the pandemic. It's worth recalling from history that basically pandemics don't end when governments say they end. They just end when the people say, we've had enough, it's over, it's finished. And it looks like huge swathes of America, they've already said that. I mean, remember Texas and Florida in particular have been living life essentially normally for over a year now. They're not in a pandemic state. India is completely back to normal. Remember, we don't talk about India very much anymore. We only talked about it for
I forgot
a few
about
weeks.
India. Sorry, that was
Yeah,
going to be the end of the world, wasn't it? Yeah.
And of course, South Africa. There is actually some stunning news from South Africa, which has come out the last day or two. I mean, aside from the realization that the Omicron variant is really nothing to be concerned about, and actually the data from South Africa is really quite stunning. So we have, for example, virtually no evidence of any significant rise in oxygen usage across a major hospital. Some data I was provided with yesterday, whereas it was 15 times normal during the Delta wave. It's hardly raised at all in the current wave. We have an average stay per patient of 2 days compared to 8 to 10 days with the Delta wave. That's really, a quarter to a fifth of the burden. And we also have a stunning sort of political development there as well, in that the Medical Advisory Committee, which is South African equivalent of SAGE, is basically advising the government, has issued a report, and we've yet to find out whether the government will fully take it on board. If they're anything like the UK government, if they don't like what they're told, they just change the members. But what the current membership are saying is, and I'll read from the report, we propose that quarantining be discontinued with immediate effect for contacts of cases of COVID-19. This applies equally to vaccinated and non-vaccinated contacts. No testing for COVID-19 is required, irrespective of the exposure risk, unless the contact becomes symptomatic. Yeah. We further propose that contact tracing be stopped.
Yeah. So South Africa has decided
it's over.
Yeah, that's South Africa. This was a decision they made at the end of last week. They considered, they've had it. Don't forget, they've had Omicron for a lot longer than we have, and they discovered it, so they know what they're talking about. Their government concluded towards the end of last week that what they were going to do about Omicron is absolutely nothing. And yet, look at our government. Why is our government not taking South Africa's decision on board? As I said to you earlier, Jonathan, why does it continue to want to catastrophize about the Omicron story when the Omicron story seems to me to be an optimistic one, where the virus will go through the nation. Lots of people will catch it, but very few will end up in hospital, and very few people will die. That's what we want, isn't it?
Absolutely. And of course, remember that the spread of this variant and people's exposure to it is likely to generate high levels of immunity within the community as well. So just to explain, the way the immune system works is that it is presented with a virus and effectively chops it up into lots of constituent parts and then creates memory against all these constituent parts so that it is ready and armed to fight that any similar virus which is presented to it. So in terms of variants, for example. So it is highly likely that infection with this Omicron variant will create immunity against future variants as well. So this is really actually very good news, because we have now the spread of a virus which all indications show has a similar lethality to a cold or a mild flu, but yet it is going to effectively produce large amounts of immunity in the community. It's good news, worth celebrating.
Yes, and yes, there are lots and lots of cases, but if people are not dying and are not going to hospital for it, then I'm afraid that's one of those things that societies and countries have to live with. You know, we do get things like flu epidemics. You know, we cannot keep shutting down the country to protect us from one condition. And that is COVID. Can you explain why it is, given everything we've just been discussing, Jonathan, that Professor Neil Ferguson, his little model that he's produced, is predicting that there could be 5,000 Omicron deaths a day this winter?
Well, maybe he just wants to be consistently wrong, as he's always been before. Doesn't like to buck the trend. I mean,
I think you're right. Yeah. Why break the habit of a lifetime and be right?
I mean, I can't recall the precise epidemics that he massively overinflated in the past, but I think it might be 4 or 5. We've got swine flu. There's foot and mouth. There's a number of other epidemics, and of course remember, the story has broken over the last few days of this SAGE modeling, and the answer to your question is probably from that story, which is that they are asked to model
for worst case scenarios. And by the way, their models predicted, I think it was a week and a half ago or so, that by now we would have 200,000 cases of Omicron a day. And health officials, and Sajid Javid was going around propagating that. He was saying it's valid. We have to be worried that could happen. Health officials now have completely abandoned it because it is quite clearly catastrophically over the top and not in any way in touch with reality. These models are the scourge of the nation, aren't they?
They are indeed. And of course, the other point about the models is that they never modeled the harms of the restrictions. And I was actually flabbergasted last year when I read that SAGE were openly saying, oh, well, we weren't asked to model harms. That's somebody else's job. And when you ask the ministers who has modeled harms, they can't come up with an answer. And basically, the information about the harms from lockdowns have been available since June 2020. We started to have information there on harms, and we could have projected harms. And yet there's been no analysis of the impact of these restrictions on the lives of British people ever performed in detail. Yeah. And it's appalling, frankly.
Yeah,
but one point I just want to make about Sajid Javid was from Hansard, he actually said that, and he must be held to this, the trigger, so to speak, for Plan B, as I mentioned in my statement, would be to look carefully at the pressures on the NHS. If at any point we deemed them to be unsustainable, if there was a significant rise in hospitalizations and we thought it was unsustainable, we would look carefully at whether we needed to take any of these Plan B measures. But we've got no particular hospital pressure, and yet they're already talking about this.
Yeah, and
it's difficult to know what to believe.
I know, and in the long term, we cannot keep. If we have a national health service that isn't working, which it isn't, We need a new health service, not a new country with a new way of living in order to facilitate our defective health system. It's absolutely crazy.
Well, exactly. Do we serve the NHS or do they serve us?
Well, at the moment, I think we know the answers to that question. Jonathan, excellent to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. Dr. Jonathan Engler, they're a member of HART Health Advisory and Recovery Team. When we come back, we'll be assessing the size of the political bombshell that exploded